control the depth. Tubes 1 and 2, fire!
Keep sharp, mister!
Hey, still clear, Aston.
Bearing 090, sir. The ping is getting faster.
Steady as she goes. What is the classification?
Charge set and ready, sir! Stand by! Fire 1!
January 1943. The North Atlantic was a gray expanse of steel-gray waves and low-hanging clouds. Ice-laden gusts whipped across the deck of U-564, a German-type VIC U-boat, moaning through the conning tower as if the sea itself were warning them. Below the surface, the world was darker, colder, and silent, save for the faint thrum of the engines and the nervous clicks of instruments. The crew huddled in the cramped pressure hull, faces pale in the dim electric light. Every sonar ping, every echo against the hull was a question, friend or foe. Every sudden creak of steel made hearts jump. Captain Reinhardt tightened his grip on the periscope. Somewhere above, unseen and relentless, Allied destroyers hunted them. This was no ordinary depth charge. They had learned to listen, to detect, to hunt with sound. And for the men aboard the U-boat, the sea had become a trap they could no longer hear coming. The first deadly pings were about to strike, and nothing would ever feel the same again. The quiet tension of the Atlantic was about to erupt. By the outbreak of World War II, Germany had already invested heavily in the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet, seeing submarines as the key to controlling the Atlantic. The early war years, 1939 to 1941, became the period historians would later call the first happy time for the German Navy. U-boats prowled the North Atlantic, invisible predators in a vast, gray ocean, sinking Allied merchant ships at an alarming rate. Convoys, the lifeblood of Britain, moved across the Atlantic with sparse escort. At first, U-boat captains exploited this vulnerability with wolfpack tactics. Groups of submarines coordinating attacks at night, overwhelming convoys with precision and brutal efficiency. The German strategy was simple in concept, but deadly in execution. Disrupt supply lines, starve Britain of fuel, food, and war materials, and force the Allies to negotiate. From September 1939 to July 1940, U-boats sank over 1,500 merchant ships, totaling more than 3 million tons. The sheer scale of the losses stunned Allied planners. The ocean, once a neutral highway, had become a deadly chessboard where the Germans had the first move. British and Canadian escort ships, destroyers, corvettes, and frigates scrambled to develop countermeasures, but for every convoy, the odds seemed stacked in favor of the hunters below the waves. Allied anti-submarine warfare was initially rudimentary. Depth charges existed, but their use was imprecise. They were gravity-fed explosives dropped from the stern, set to explode at estimated depths. The explosions could damage or destroy a submarine, but only if the U-boat happened to be directly beneath the ship. Sonar, or acoustic, allowed some detection, but readings were often ambiguous, especially in rough seas or at night. Meanwhile, the Germans adapted quickly. They could sense when a convoy employed sonar, adjust depth, and evade charges. For a time, the hunters became the hunted. But technology alone did not win battles. Human skill, nerve, and instinct played a decisive role. U-boat crews learned to read the water, the subtle pressure of a propeller, the faint echo of an enemy ship's hull against the waves. Every officer relied on intuition honed by long hours underwater, a continuous tension between action and survival. Captains like Eric Topp, Otto Kretschmer, and Gunther Preen became legends, not for their ferocity, but for their precise timing, calculated risk-taking, and ruthless efficiency. Meanwhile, the Allies were forced into innovation by necessity. The Battle of the Atlantic was more than a series of naval encounters. It was a race for technology, intelligence, and endurance. Convoy systems were refined, air cover expanded, and code breaking at Bletchley Park began, providing vital information on U-boat positions. Every intercepted radio transmission gave Allied destroyers a slight advantage, but nothing compared to what would soon arrive: the ability to track and kill submarines not by chance, but by design. Yet even with these measures, the Germans remained confident in their supremacy beneath the waves. The Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine, was fast, maneuverable, and lethal. A single submarine could sink dozens of ships in a single patrol. And as long as the Allies relied on traditional tactics, the U-boat's dominance seemed unshakable. But the ocean is a patient enemy. It listens, it hides, and it teaches harsh lessons to those who underestimate it. By late 1942, the tide was beginning to turn. Allied innovations in sonar, radar, and air reconnaissance gradually reduced the U-boat's advantage. Yet for the men in the steel pressure hulls, danger was immediate, relentless, and invisible. The coming years would see submarines facing weapons they could not see and could not hear until the first sound-guided depth charges arrived. The stage was set. The hunters of the Atlantic were about to discover that their prey could fight back in ways they had never imagined. By late 1942, the Allies faced a stark reality. Traditional anti-submarine tactics were proving insufficient. Convoys remained under attack, and losses, though mitigated, were still severe. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet, armed with increasingly experienced crews, exploited the ocean's vastness with near impunity. Something radical was needed. That innovation came in the form of acoustic-guided weapons, a new era in naval warfare. The key breakthrough was sound-based detection and targeting. While sonar, or ASTIC, had allowed surface ships to locate submarines, it had limitations. U-boats could dive deep, run silent, or use thermal layers to distort sonar readings. Early depth charges required guesswork. Set to explode at a calculated depth, they relied on luck as much as skill. To overcome this, engineers designed explosives that could home in on the sound of a submarine's propellers. The first of these weapons, deployed in limited numbers by the Royal Navy, was the Mark X acoustic depth charge, soon followed by more sophisticated versions like Hedgehog and Squid mortars. These weapons changed the game. No longer did a ship need to be directly above a submarine. Instead, the explosive could track the faint vibrations of a U-boat's engines, following the sound like a predator tracking its prey. For the German crews, the phenomenon was almost unimaginable. Submariners had been trained to fear depth charges, but not ones that actively hunted them, anticipating their movements and responding to their evasions. The technology itself was intricate. Hydrophones, carefully calibrated, picked up the low-frequency hum of a U-boat's propeller. This signal directed a guided charge toward the submarine. Operators on Allied ships learned to distinguish engine noise from ambient ocean sounds, a subtle art requiring patience, training, and acute hearing. Soon, specialized escort groups could deploy these weapons with devastating precision. In trials, a single guided charge had a much higher probability of striking its target than dozens of conventional explosives. Allied intelligence played a pivotal role. Ultra-intercepts of German naval communications provided insights into U-boat positions, movements, and patrol patterns. When combined with acoustic weapons, this intelligence created a lethal synergy. Escorts no longer relied solely on reactive tactics. They could plan attacks based on predictive data, effectively cornering submarines that had once stalked their convoys with impunity. Meanwhile, German awareness lagged. U-boat crews had heard stories of experimental Allied devices, but specifics were scarce. The very idea that a weapon could track the sound of a vessel beneath miles of water was almost mythic. Captains speculated, adjusted tactics, and ran silent, but the true nature of acoustic-guided charges remained largely unknown. This gap in understanding created a profound psychological edge for the Allies. Fear of the invisible, the unpredictable, and the unstoppable. By early 1943, acoustic depth charges began appearing along critical convoy routes, particularly in the North Atlantic. Encounters were initially rare, almost anecdotal. U-boat captains reported explosions that seemed to follow them, even when they had taken evasive action. These early skirmishes, while limited in scale, revealed the weapon's potential. German crews began to sense that the oceans were no longer safe, that the hunter could become the hunted in ways they could not anticipate. The combination of technology, intelligence, and tactical innovation was quietly reshaping the Battle of the Atlantic. Allied escorts could now attack submarines with unprecedented effectiveness, while U-boat commanders struggled to comprehend the invisible threat. What had once been a contest of skill and endurance was evolving into a confrontation where machines could anticipate human decisions, and sound itself became a weapon. It was in this environment of uncertainty and escalating tension that submariners would soon face the true horror of the acoustic age. The next section will explore how this transformation affected every facet of the conflict. The human element, tactical decisions, leadership, and technological arms races that defined life and death beneath the waves. Below the surface, the pressure hull of a U-boat was a world unto itself. Men lived in close quarters, the air thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and fear. Every creak of the steel hull became a heartbeat of tension. For the crews, psychological strain was constant. Submerged for days at a time, they relied on memory, instinct, and the captain's orders to survive. Each sonar ping from an unseen enemy above was a reminder. They were being hunted. The human element of anti-submarine warfare cannot be overstated. Even the most skilled U-boat captain faced a simple truth. While his decisions mattered, he was operating in an environment where the sea and enemy technology often held the final say. Crewmen reported heart rates spiking when depth charges detonated nearby. Their bodies braced for impact, their minds racing with contingency plans. Fatigue compounded fear. Long patrols left men vulnerable to lapses in judgment, and under the new threat of sound-guided depth charges, the margin for error disappeared entirely. Tactically, the Germans had developed evasive maneuvers honed over years of experience. U-boats would dive deep, alter course, or reduce speed to minimize acoustic signature. Silent running became a disciplined, nerve-wracking exercise. Every valve adjustment, engine shift, and propeller movement was calculated to avoid detection. Yet the new Allied technology was designed precisely to counter these tactics. Submariners found that traditional evasion, once almost a guarantee of survival, was increasingly ineffective. Allied escort vessels, by contrast, approached with calculated aggression. Convoy escort groups coordinated attacks using sonar sweeps, hydrophones, and depth charge mortars. The crews of these ships learned to interpret subtle changes in sound, predicting a submarine's path before it could react. Night attacks, once a gamble, became systematic operations. Small formations of corvettes or destroyers could isolate a target, cut off escape routes, and strike with near-lethal precision. For the hunter, the ocean was a partner. For the hunted, it had become a labyrinth filled with invisible traps. The tension extended beyond individual encounters. U-boat commanders had to balance risk and reward. Each patrol offered the chance to sink valuable tonnage, but with every engagement, the threat of guided depth charges grew. Decisions that once seemed routine, surfacing to recharge batteries, approaching a convoy, maneuvering into attack position, became perilous calculations. One misstep, one misjudged depth, and the entire crew could be lost. The psychological warfare of the acoustic age was as real as any explosive. Crews began reporting phantom sounds, reacting to imagined pings, second-guessing every movement. Letters sent home, post-war interviews, and official logs all confirmed the strain. Men became hyper-aware, obsessively monitoring instruments, sometimes unable to rest even when safely submerged. The invisible nature of the threat compounded fear. Unlike conventional depth charges, which could be anticipated through observation or timing, sound-guided explosives were intelligent predators. They punished the slightest mistake. Tactically, the introduction of acoustic weapons forced rapid adaptation. U-boat commanders experimented with countermeasures, like cushioned decoys, to mislead homing charges. Some altered propeller speeds, hoping to mask the noise signature. Others relied on terrain, diving under thermal layers or near the seabed to obscure acoustic readings. Yet none of these measures offered guaranteed safety. Each encounter became a deadly game of cat and mouse, one in which the Allies held a technological edge that was invisible, unpredictable, and terrifying. The human and tactical angles converged in every encounter. Skill, experience, and courage mattered, but so did timing, luck, and the unforgiving environment. The ocean was no longer neutral. It had been weaponized. For the men in the U-boat, every decision, every turn of a valve, every silent maneuver was a wager against a hunter that could listen to their every move. And as the Allies refined their techniques, the waters of the North Atlantic became a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance under pressure, both mechanical and psychological. The stage was now set to examine the technological and leadership perspectives, where sound-guided depth charges not only redefined tactics, but also reshaped command decisions on both sides of the Atlantic. While human courage and tactical skill defined life aboard a U-boat, it was technology that ultimately shifted the balance of the Atlantic. Acoustic-guided depth charges represented a leap forward in anti-submarine warfare. Unlike conventional explosives, which detonated at a preset depth, these devices could track the faint vibrations of submarines' propellers, homing in on their target with terrifying precision. For Allied commanders, the challenge was to harness this technology effectively. For German crews, it seemed almost supernatural. The The science behind the weapon was deceptively simple. Hydrophones detected propeller noise, feeding the signal to a guidance system that adjusted the detonation path of the explosive. Even slight variations in engine speed or propeller pitch could be interpreted, allowing the charge to follow a submarine through the water. Early versions, such as the Royal Navy's Mark X, were crude by modern standards but effective. Later systems, including Hedgehog and Squid, incorporated mortars capable of firing multiple projectiles, saturating an area with sound-seeking explosives. Tests revealed that a single attack could achieve the probability of a kill once only dreamed of with dozens of traditional depth charges. Leadership decisions were central to the deployment of these weapons. Allied captains had to integrate intelligence from multiple sources: ultra-intercepts, sonar readings, and convoy positions, into coherent attack strategies. Officers like Captain Frederick John Walker, commanding the 2nd Escort Group, became experts at coordinating attacks, anticipating U-boat evasions, and directing crews under extreme pressure. Walker's approach was methodical: isolate, predict, and strike. Success depended not only on the technology, but on disciplined execution. German commanders, by contrast, faced a crisis of perception. Accustomed to being the hunter, they now confronted weapons whose behavior they could neither see nor hear in advance. The Type 7 and 9 U-boats had once dominated the Atlantic with stealth and precision. Now, intelligence reports hinted at Allied innovations they could scarcely comprehend. U-boat leadership scrambled to issue counter-instructions, vary depth, alter propeller pitch, deploy decoys, but the unpredictability of the sound-guided charges rendered many of these measures partially ineffective. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical one. Technological innovation also forced strategic adaptations. The Allies invested heavily in training operators to interpret hydrophone signals, ensuring that the new weapons were not only deployed but maximized. Escort groups were reorganized, with ships specializing in coordinated hunts, alternating sonar sweeps, and attacks that minimized U-boat escape options. In essence, technology amplified leadership, turning individual skill into coordinated lethality. On the German side, leadership faced the dual burden of preserving morale while maintaining operational effectiveness. Captains like Erich Topp or Otto Kretschmer instructed their crews to trust instruments, minimize noise, and remain calm. But the invisible, intelligent threat created constant tension. Commanders had to make split-second decisions without fully understanding the forces arrayed against them, a scenario that undermined confidence and introduced second-guessing at every level. The moral dimension cannot be ignored. Acoustic-guided depth charges were designed to kill with efficiency. Their introduction raised no questions in the Allied command about legality or fairness. The goal was survival and victory. For German submariners, however, the weapon seemed almost uncanny, a machine that could anticipate human reaction, turning skill and cunning into vulnerabilities. Encounters became as much psychological warfare as physical conflict. Ultimately, the technological and leadership angles were inseparable. Allied success relied on commanders who understood the capabilities of new weapons and could coordinate them with intelligence and human skill. German failure, or survival, depended on improvisation, intuition, and resilience under conditions increasingly dictated by machines. The sea itself became a medium through which leadership, technology, and human endurance collided. The human courage and tactical maneuvering of the U-boat crews had defined the early years of the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, technology and leadership had rewritten the rules of engagement, setting the stage for encounters that would push both men and machines to the limits. April 1943. The North Atlantic was a gray wasteland of wind-whipped waves, fog, and rolling swells. Convoys of merchant ships, bristling with cargo and escorted by corvettes and destroyers, plowed through the turbulent sea. Somewhere beneath the surface, U-203 prowled, its steel hull slicing through the cold water, engines muffled for silent running. Captain Klaus Schultz had relied on this tactic countless times, evading Allied sonar and depth charges. But this time, something felt different. The first warning came not from sight, but from sound. A faint vibration, almost imperceptible, reverberated through the pressure hull. The crew exchanged tense glances. Hydrophones confirmed it. There was movement above them, but it didn't match any typical convoy pattern. The U-boat adjusted depth and course, hoping to slip between the escorting destroyers. Then came the explosion, soft at first, a distant thrum that rattled plates and lockers. Unlike conventional depth charges, the blast seemed to follow the U-boat, tracking every evasive maneuver. The crew realized the unimaginable. The enemy could hear them, anticipate their movements, and strike with terrifying precision. Heartbeats quickened, sweat-stung eyes in the dim light of the control room, and hands trembled as instruments were read and reread. The destroyers above employed the Hedgehog mortars. Dozens of small, contact-fused projectiles arched through the air and plunged into the Atlantic, each one homing in on propeller noise. Schultz ordered emergency maneuvers, turning, varying speed, and diving deeper, but the charges adjusted in real time, honing in on the vibrations of the propellers. Every decision felt simultaneously too late and inadequate. Other U-boats were facing similar fates. U-444 and U-569, patrolling near a heavily escorted convoy to the east, were suddenly under attack. Crewmen reported explosions that followed the boat like a shadow, a phrase later repeated in post-war interviews. Captains attempted traditional evasive maneuvers, zigzagging, silent running, dropping decoys. Yet the sound-guided depth charges were not fooled. For the first time, the ocean itself seemed to betray the submariners' presence. Allied operators above water were methodical and calm, a stark contrast to the panic below. Sonar operators tracked the faint propeller signals, directing Hedgehog attacks with surgical precision. Captain Frederick Walker, commanding an escort group off the western approaches, coordinated a sequence of attacks, isolating U-boats from the convoy, pressing them to predictable depths, and saturating their positions with guided explosives. The U-boats' speed and maneuverability, once their greatest assets, were neutralized. For the crew of U-203, minutes stretched into eternity. Each tremor, each distant rumble, was a potential death sentence. Men gripped rails, knuckles white, waiting for the unmistakable jolt that meant a charge had hit. Some prayed silently, others cursed. Every maneuver was calculated to perfection, or it was over. And yet, survival was possible. Schultz's experience, calm under pressure, and mastery of the submarine's capabilities allowed the boat to evade the first series of strikes. But the realization had already sunk in. The Atlantic was no longer just a battleground of skill and stealth. It was now a highly tuned acoustic kill zone. Across the ocean, the psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound. Reports circulated of men hesitating to surface, delaying battery recharges, and enduring hours of submerged tension that frayed nerves. Many described it as a new kind of fear, one rooted not in what could be seen, but in what could be heard. The humans were no longer the hunters. They had become the hunted. This was the turning point of the undersea war. Technology and tactics converged in a deadly embrace, forcing U-boats to confront a reality they could neither fully predict nor understand. The hunt had escalated, and the stakes could not have been higher. The hunt reached its deadly crescendo in the spring of 1943. U-boats that had once stalked convoys with impunity now faced enemies that listened, calculated, and struck. On April 23rd, U-569, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Gerhard Remus, was patrolling the North Atlantic near convoy HX-233. The submarine's hydrophones picked up faint propeller sounds above, and instinct told Remus something was wrong. The first Hedgehog salvo struck not far astern, shaking the boat, dislodging equipment, and sending a tremor of panic through the crew. The attack sequence was relentless. Allied destroyers, coordinated by Captain Frederick Walker, saturated the area with guided charges. Every maneuver U-569 executed, turning, changing depth, running silent, was anticipated. The acoustic charges followed, small but deadly, each one a product of careful calculation and acoustic technology. At 13:47 hours, the first direct impact shook the hull violently. Men were thrown to the floor, instruments shattered, water seeped through the seams. One misjudged movement, 1 second too late, and the submarine would be crushed under the ocean's weight. Meanwhile, U-203, despite Captain Schultz's skill, endured repeated strikes. The crew reported that explosions seemed to dance around the submarine, striking near enough to inflict structural stress without immediately sinking the vessel. The purpose was tactical: disorient, exhaust, and force errors. Over hours, men were pushed to their physical and mental limits. Exhaustion, claustrophobia, and constant fear combined into a pressure heavier than the Atlantic itself. Casualties were immediate in some cases. U-444 was not as fortunate. Caught in the open, it sustained critical damage after successive Hedgehog attacks. Reports indicate flooding in the forward compartments, incapacitated crew, and eventual force scuttling. Survivors described hearing the guided charges follow their movements, as if the ocean itself had become intelligent. For German crews, the psychological terror was as lethal as the explosions. The outcome of these encounters was decisive. In April 1943 alone, the Allies destroyed or forced the scuttling of 6 U-boats using acoustic-guided weapons and coordinated escort tactics. Losses, though numerically small compared to total U-boat strength, had an outsized impact on morale. Experienced captains who had survived countless conventional depth charge attacks were now facing a weapon they could not predict. Confidence eroded, and risk assessment shifted dramatically. Wolfpack attacks became more cautious, patrols shorter, and the Atlantic increasingly dominated by Allied anti-submarine operations. Technologically, the success validated years of research. Hedgehog and squid mortars, hydrophone-guided depth charges, and coordinated sonar sweeps proved that sound could be weaponized. Commanders on both sides took note. Allied leadership, confident in their growing technological edge, pressed forward with aggressive anti-submarine patrols, while German command scrambled to devise countermeasures. Acoustic decoys, alterations in propeller noise, and thermal layer tactics offered partial relief, but could not fully mitigate the threat. For the men trapped in steel hulls below, the lesson was stark and personal. Mastery of the sea no longer guaranteed survival. Submarine warfare, once a contest of stealth and daring, had evolved into a battle between human skill and technological precision. Every creak of steel, every minor vibration, every subtle sonar ping was a potential death sentence. The Atlantic had become a lethal symphony of sound, with submariners caught in the lowest, darkest notes. The immediate tactical consequences were equally profound. Convoys that had previously suffered heavy losses began reaching ports with fewer casualties. Allied shipping lanes grew more secure, enabling the continuous flow of troops, supplies, and equipment essential for campaigns in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually the invasion of Europe. Meanwhile, the Kriegsmarine faced not just a material challenge, losses of ships and crews, but a strategic one, as the very nature of U-boat warfare had shifted. The clash between human ingenuity and machine-guided precision marked a turning point. Acoustic depth charges were no longer experimental. They had proven their effectiveness in the crucible of combat. U-boat crews understood that the hunter had become the hunted. They were no longer operating with the psychological certainty that had defined their early successes. Now, every dive, every maneuver, every sound could spell doom. As the survivors of these encounters repaired, regrouped, and reflected, one truth became clear. The Battle of the Atlantic had entered a new phase. The introduction of sound-guided weapons had transformed tactics, shattered confidence, and set the stage for the final campaigns that would gradually erode German undersea dominance. The hunters above had become lethal predators in their own right, and the ocean itself, once a neutral expanse, had become a battlefield of sound and steel. The story of German submariners facing sound-guided depth charges is more than a tale of steel and explosives. It is a story of human endurance confronted by innovation, a collision of skill, fear, and technology beneath the indifferent expanse of the Atlantic. Men who had once dominated the waves now faced weapons that could anticipate their moves, striking with precision that made the ocean itself seem alive, intelligent, and merciless. Acoustic-guided depth charges transformed warfare under the sea. They were not just instruments of destruction. They were instruments of inevitability, forcing a reevaluation of tactics, leadership, and the very nature of survival. The hunters became the hunted. Every decision, every maneuver, every hum of machinery carried consequences that could not be ignored. For the submariners, fear became constant, a companion as palpable as the steel walls around them, and as vital as oxygen in the flooded compartments of the pressure hull. Yet in this crucible, human courage endured. U-boat crews adapted, improvised, and survived against overwhelming odds. Commanders made split-second decisions under the weight of unseen threats, and ordinary sailors endured psychological pressures that stretched the limits of endurance. Their struggle illuminates a universal truth. War is as much a contest of mind and nerve as it is of weapons and steel. The legacy of sound-guided weapons extended far beyond the Atlantic. They reshaped anti-submarine strategy, informed naval doctrine for generations, and marked a turning point in the integration of technology with human decision-making in warfare. Above all, they remind us that innovation, whether in sound, code, or steel, can redefine the battlefield entirely, leaving human beings to confront forces that are invisible, relentless, and transformative. In the end, the echoes of the Atlantic's underwater battles resonate not only in history books or tactical manuals, but in the human experience itself. Courage tested under silence, ingenuity measured against inevitability, and the enduring lesson that the oceans may hide their dangers, but they cannot hide the cost of war.